Hello everyone, and welcome to the final session of the inaugural Stella Day Out, which is here in Melbourne. My name is Fiona Sweet. I'm the Executive Director and CEO of Stella, or Stella Prize. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are visiting, which is the Wurundjeri and Kulin Nation, and I gratefully acknowledge and respect their elders past and present, and acknowledge that sovereignty has never been ceded. So many of you have joined us for the full day, so I want to thank you for staying for an entire day to listen to the 4 sessions. This final session is with Sarah Holland-Batt and Astrid Edwards. Unfortunately, due to unforeseen circumstances, Sarah Holland-Batt was unable to come to Melbourne, but she is Zooming in, and since our years of COVID, I think we're more used to and more attuned to a video interview. And thank you to John back in the tech room for doing an incredible job with our Zoom. Astrid will be chatting today with Sarah about her fantastic win for the 2023 Stella Prize, and really what her journey is now since she's won the prize. After the conversation, we will be, and just to let everyone know, the conversation will be a little bit shorter than the other conversations today. It will only be 40 minutes and we won't be doing questions for this talk. After the conversation, back out in the bar area, our fabulous Stella Ambassador, Catherine Andrews, will be joining us to give us a small talk, not too long, but just enough to give you a bit of an overview of Stella and Stella Day Out. And so let's put our hands together for Astrid Edwards and Sarah Holland-Batt.
Hello, Sarah.
Hello, Astrid. How are you?
I'm doing very well. Thank you so much for joining us via Zoom. I think that what you can see, if I'm right, is the audience and then the stage.
I can see you, Astrid.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, let's start then. Just so you know, there is an audience here, and I think we're all very excited. Now, Sarah, the Jaguar has been out in the world for more than a year, and you have been the Stella Prize winner for about 6 months. I'd like to ask if your experience of your own work or, the act of sharing it with the world in such a high-profile way has changed how you engage with or think of your own creation.
That's a really good question, Astrid. I mean, I think with poetry, you never quite expect it to have a huge audience, and so when on those rare occasions when it does, receive a large audience like that, it's quite a beautiful and slightly overwhelming thing to have quite so many people reading a book. But that's been really beautiful. I mean, one of the big gifts I feel, excuse me, has been having the opportunity to chat to people at writers' festivals who've shared their own stories of grief, their own stories of parents who may have had Parkinson's or other neurodegenerative diseases, experiences of caring. So in that way, I feel like what the platform has done for me is actually just introduced poetry to a group of people who may not have otherwise read it, and it's been really gratifying that people, on the whole, have enjoyed it when they've had that encounter. So it's been quite wild to have a larger audience than you would possibly hope to have for poetry, but in the nicest way. I've had nothing but a positive experience from that and from those conversations.
Earlier today, this is the Stella Day Out, and earlier today there was a session on poetry and also a session on the kind of history of the Stella Prize. Poetry only recently came into the Stella with Evelyn Araluen Strotbear, and now you're the Jaguar. But you've mentioned audience and, kind of implied that a lot of people don't really read that much poetry in Australia. Can you reflect on, the idea of having just such a bigger audience that is not common in fiction, and it's even less common in poetry or other forms?
I mean, I think the thing with poetry in Australia is often people, may not have the best experiences with it in school, and that can put people off. And I think it's an unfortunate thing, because poetry is a form that it has some mystery in it. It's not always totally immediately and instantly understood, and it's a form that asks you to sit with it and engage with it in a sort of slow reading kind of way. And for people who may not be totally comfortable with that, or have had negative experiences with that in school, I think the opportunity to revisit it as an adult and maybe change your perspective on this art form is a rare and beautiful thing. I often have conversations with people, sometimes with my students, who'll say things like, "Oh, I just don't get poetry," and I'll say to them, "Okay, how much of it have you read?" And the answer is often not very much at all, or maybe one or two poems, and I didn't like those. And my response to that is sort of a little bit like, well, if you only listened to one kind of techno song and then told me that you didn't like music, I might suggest to you, maybe go and listen to a little bit more music. There's a lot out there, and that's really the situation with contemporary poetry. There's a whole lot of different modes of poetry, a whole lot of different styles of poetry, and so I think it's been really lovely to be that conduit, I hope, for people. I mean, it's lovely that they read my book, but my hope is always that might send them into a bookshop to ask to look at the poetry section and have a browse, because for poets like Evelyn and I, who have had the great luck and grace of having this kind of acknowledgement, there's so many other really, really fantastic contemporary poets out there. And so I sort of hope that, it's lovely for me personally, but my hope is that it would also hopefully encourage readers to go out there and explore a little bit more poetry as well.
So the Jaguar is, of course, poetry, but it's also poetry about caring and aging and death and the experience of those loved ones around the person experiencing illness. You have spoken quite a bit about the Jaguar this year, obviously, Sarah, and you have previously said that for a long time you didn't think that those kind of topics were appropriate for poetry, that you couldn't put them into a poem. Sorry, I interrupted you, Sarah.
No. I mean, please continue. Sorry, I think there's a tiny delay.
So my question was, how did you find the language in the medium of poetry to discuss such important things that we will all engage with or experience at some point in our life, either ourselves or for those around us?
I mean, it's an interesting question, the question of how we write about death and grief. And I think we have very sort of pat ways of talking about it when we speak to each other, when we speak to neighbours or friends or even family sometimes, when there's been death or bereavement or even difficulty towards the end of life. I think we have a pretty hampered and small vocabulary to talk about those things. And, I mean, it's that classic thing, even with cancer, people talk about it being a battle or a struggle. You get the sort of same kind of language that doesn't really, to me, go to the depth of the experience at all, which is more complicated. Yes, it's sad, but it's also, I think, a complex balance of emotions. In Dad's end of life, and indeed in his aging, there were moments of deep humour and poignancy and beauty among all of the sort of other difficult things and the challenging things and the grief. And so, for me, the challenge as a poet was to try and find, I suppose, a different set of words, a different set of images that I hoped would speak to that. And one of the things I've been thinking about a lot in writing the book was also how often death is really sanitised. It's sanitised in our language, in the way we talk about it, but also in the way we experience it. We go into hospital, we go into some of the most sterile, blank, white kind of spaces that there are. And this huge thing is happening in those spaces, that, this very animal thing, the end of life, is happening in this sort of stark space. And so in the poems, I wanted to, I suppose, push back against that kind of depiction and bring in that sense of the human being as an animal, I suppose, in the heart of that. So this is a slightly kind of long answer to your question, but I think coming round to your question of how do you find a language for that, I think for me it was an act of pushing against the received kinds of ideas that we have about death and dying, and that it was about me thinking about what that experience really had been like for me watching my dad, which was there were so many little tender and poignant moments that were really dad, being a human being in a human body in a very kind of alien environment of the hospital. And so in the end, I think the book draws quite a lot of natural imagery, a lot on the imagery of the natural world and predation and so forth, to try and explore those ideas. So that's kind of how I got there in the end. But it was a long process of thinking through it, I think, because it's not a subject that we have easy conversations about either. So then working out how to write your way into it in a way that you hope that a reader will want to engage with as well. That's the other side of poetry. It's not personal catharsis. It's actually a form that you're hoping will reach others. For me, those were the kinds of concerns I was thinking about. Sorry, that was a long answer, Astrid.
You do not need to apologise for your answers of any length, Sarah. I admit that I picked up the Jaguar with a lot of hesitation. I'm a person with chronic neurodegenerative illness. I have multiple sclerosis, and I hate the representations of illness in most contemporary literature. And I adore the Jaguar. I think that how you put the experience of illness of your father, but also of the people around him, including yourself, is remarkable and beautiful. But I wanted to talk to you about that perception of, I was really ready to hate it because it is done so badly so often. And so I'd like your thoughts on, what makes it go wrong? How does it go wrong so often in literature?
That's a huge question, and I'm interested in your thoughts on that too, Astrid. I think there's many kind of prongs to it. I mean, when I think about my dad at his end of life, he was really part of the most vulnerable cohort, I think, in our community, other than young infants. In that, he was, his body was vulnerable, his mind was not what it used to be, and so at that intersection, of course, he himself had no voice, he had no capacity to speak for himself, and that was evident in small and large ways in his trajectory through Parkinson's and then our aged care system. And so I think in part it's ageism. When we talk about older people with disabilities like my dad, there's ageism and there's also fear and taboo. And I think while we like to sort of joke about death, and I think Australians sometimes can have a great sense of humour, dark sense of humour about these things, we don't actually like to speak about it in a serious way at all. And it's almost a taboo subject that people will try and steer conversation away from. And I think in that gap of not speaking about it and not speaking openly about it, I think certain prejudices, are allowed to flourish, and the fact that people like my father, someone towards the end of his life, who didn't have any real capacity to speak for himself, end up being spoken for in various ways, and sometimes in quite dehumanising ways, as we saw, particularly through the pandemic and some of that discourse about older people being a burden on society, being a strain on society, even some of the ways we speak about our aged care system, speaking about there being a quote-unquote silver tsunami, which as a poet, I have to, on the one hand, give props because that's a very catchy little phrase. On the other hand, I critique that because, of course, people aging are not a natural disaster. But these are the sorts of ways that we speak about people towards the end of their life. And so I think that is how that silence, is allowed to flourish, really, because ultimately those people don't have much of a voice to speak for themselves often or share their own perspectives. So I think it is important that, we think really carefully about the ways we speak about these things, about the metaphors we use to describe illness, disability, cognitive decline. It's often held out to be the worst thing imaginable. But I saw with my dad, there was definitely the capacity for him to have good days or bad days, depending on how he was treated, depending on the environment he was in. So it's a thorny problem. And I think as writers, we can't really solve societal ageism or discrimination wholesale. But what we can do, I think, is put work into the world that allows for some of that, complexity, hopefully. If that answers your question.
It does, Sarah, and it does it so beautifully. Kind of following on from that, but from a different angle, what has been the most memorable response that you have received from a reader?
Excuse me, I'm sorry, I got a bit of a cough. Look, actually, the nicest thing, this is probably a strange answer. I had a lovely teenage girl who was writing an essay on the Jaguar Fund for her high school assignment, and it's not unusual to get emails from teenagers asking me what a poem means. I've had that quite a lot, and so it was an email a bit like that. But she said, "Oh, look, I've been reading this book, and I'm going to write my essay on it. I was wondering if you'd have time for a Zoom for some questions." And so, of course, I said yes. There's nothing poets like more than finding a reader. And so she was incredibly sweet. She prepared really, really thoughtful questions, some of the best, questions I've been asked really about the book. And then towards the end of it, she said to me, "Oh, can I ask you why there are so many minerals in the book? Why there's so many rocks and minerals?" And that wasn't really something that I had consciously chosen to do at all, in fact. But my dad had been a mineral metallurgist, and when I was a child, when you go bring your child to work day, in Dad's office there was only one book that was worth reading, and that was his illustrated encyclopedia of rocks and minerals, which I used to read through as a child. And I remember, looking at the cinnabar and looking at the quartz and all these beautiful names and all these beautiful rocks. And obviously they've migrated into my poetry, but it was just really beautiful that that a teenager had spent that time with the book to that extent to kind of notice these words that had attracted me, so long ago in my dad's office. So that's been really beautiful. And then I suppose on the other side have just been all the stories that people have shared with me of their own griefs, their own experiences with aging parents, with caregiving. That's been quite surprising in signing queues at festivals and things like that, how much people are willing to divulge. And I think there are a lot of stories out there that people would like to share but don't feel that they have the outlet to. So those are the two that I'd say.
That student is very impressive. Now, in addition to being a poet who won the Stella Prize this year, Sarah, you are an educator, you are a professor of communications, and you do think about how to use words and stories to change other people. The Jaguar has made an impression. I think we can say that, and it has made an impression across industries. I was wondering if you are aware of any, plans for educators, but also doctors or kind of in the medical profession to use the Jaguar as, a way in to think about palliative care or to think about aging, without that sterile hospital lens.
Yeah, that's a great question, Astrid, and I'm really fortunate in that I've done some of that work already. I was very lucky last year to be in residence at the Charles Perkins Centre at the University of Sydney, which is a wonderful medical research institute. And every year, for the writers in the room who don't know about this is something you should think about applying for. Every year, once a year, they have a writer in residence, and you get to hang out in a building full of neurologists and scientists. It's pretty amazing. And in that residency, I was very lucky to meet a geriatrician who trains younger geriatricians, so training the doctors who will go into aged care and to geriatrics. And her name's Dr. Sue Ogle, and she had me come and speak to some of her trainee geriatricians, and we used my poems as a kind of case study alongside my dad's medical history, and gave the students both the poems and the kind of medical records of my dad. And I suppose in getting that family perspective and getting that witness perspective, I suppose, of a family member and the humanising perspective of some of Dad's life stories and why he was behaving the way he was, why he was hallucinating the things that he was at those times. The doctors, the young doctors, the feedback was that they found that really, really enlightening, and that often, I do have sympathy for doctors in that I know they have limited time with patients as well. So it's not a question of doctors not doing a good job, but it's a question of how do we bridge that divide between the older person who can't tell their stories, who may not seem personable, quote unquote, in a meeting, but who has this rich life experience and who has this personal story that will inform the way they behave when they have dementia or the way they behave when they're having some sort of episode. I think bridging that through storytelling is really important. So yeah, it's been really lovely. I've had quite a lot of response from doctors, medical researchers and so forth. In my experience, doctors tend to really love poetry. I'm not sure why that is. Maybe it's because they're time poor and they like short art forms. But it's been a lovely response, I think, on that side of things as well.
Every time I hear someone mention the Charles Perkins fellowship that you had, Sarah, it's so amazing. This is a little bit off topic, but two former Stella listed authors, Charlotte Wood and Emily Maguire, just off the top of my head, have also had that. It is a really amazing thing in the literary scene. Building on what you just spoke about, Sarah, I've been Googling you, and you were recently named Patron of Aged Care Reform Now. That is because you have been doing advocacy for a very long time before you published the Jaguar and since. But I wanted to ask, with becoming a patron, how has the reception of the Jaguar kind of changed the reach of the advocacy you are able to do, if that makes sense as a question?
I think it's a good question. I don't know the answer to that, to be honest with you, Astrid, just yet, because in a sense, the aged care policy area, which is the area that I've done advocacy, for those in the audience who don't know, my dad had very poor experiences in aged care prior to passing away. I testified at the Royal Commission, and that's how I became involved in the cause of reforming our aged care system. At present, they are writing a new Aged Care Act, and I've had some involvement, in a minor way, but in being consulted on aspects of that policy and contributing to it. And so I feel it's an interesting and slightly optimistic time, and that I think something is actually finally slowly, and legislation is slow, but is actually happening. So in terms of the timing of my book and what that means for advocacy, personally at the moment, I'm focusing my advocacy on that policy space rather than, I've done a lot of public advocacy, I've done a lot of writing and op-eds and things like that about aged care, but I think given that there are good faith kind of engagements with the government who actually are now taking up that cause of rewriting the Aged Care Act and instigating reforms, I think for me the most kind of productive thing to do is to try and be part of that. And obviously I would speak out and speak up whenever I feel that there's issues that need attending to. But I do hold some optimism at the moment. That doesn't quite answer your question of the book and whether that's effective or not. I mean, I have heard from some policymakers who've read it, which is really lovely. And you hope that, if anything, you hope that might hopefully motivate people to take, an added concern for people who are in that vulnerable space and remember their humanity and make policy accordingly.
I suspect that everybody who has read the Jaguar, whether it's an individual poem or the whole collection, very much has your back in this advocacy and policy work, Sarah. I'd like to switch tacks a little bit and kind of come back to the role or the place of poetry in the literary scene. As we mentioned before, you are the second poet to win the Stella Prize, but you've been writing poetry for decades. Can you maybe reflect on, both in your capacity as poet, but also as an educator who educates young writers and young poets, about what you have seen change?
I do think that poetry is having a moment of interest, and that makes me really happy, because I think when I first started writing poetry in Australia, there, almost as a badge of honour, poetry sort of insisted that it was marginal to literary culture and sort of, in its own little bracket. And I've always thought, I mean, I was very lucky. I spent my high school years in the United States, and so, in America, there is a very different attitude towards poetry. America has a lot wrong with it, of course, but one of the things it gets really right is that poetry is, really central to its sense of literary culture, and there's a real veneration of poetry. And so I've always felt there's a bit of a disconnect in Australia, because the work that's being produced is really amazing, and yet it hasn't always had the readership that it's deserved. So I do think that things are changing, and I think the inclusion of poetry, first of all, in the Prime Minister's Literary Awards, which it was excluded from initially, in the Stella, things like that do help. The announcement that there'll be a National Poet Laureate as part of the Revive cultural policy is a really exciting development as well. So I think there's always been a lot happening, but the challenge has been to find poetry the readers that it deserves, I think. And so that's something that I take very seriously and try and change minds, certainly at the university, but also hopefully beyond. I think that most people who think that they can't read poetry or don't like it absolutely would and can and will. And the challenge is just matching people with the poetry that they think they'll enjoy and giving them access and opportunity to engage with it.
I know you have been not part of the advocacy, but spoken out in support of the idea of a poet laureate. I am fascinated by that idea. It sounds a beautiful thing for Australia to have. What's the difference, I guess, between having a national poet laureate than having prizes like the Stella that do award the top prize to poets?
So I think the Stella is unusual in that, as a prize, I think the general public has a really high level of awareness about it, and most literary prizes are followed by people in the literary world and not many other people. So the Stella does have that capacity, I think, to encourage people to buy or engage with books of poetry, which is really fantastic. But I think beyond that, the idea of someone whose job it is to create readers for poetry. I think the Stella is fantastic, but it is a book prize, and it's a prize, recognising someone's particular body of work. The idea of a poet laureate is essentially someone who, dedicates a couple of years of their life to the task of going around the country and finding their own means and ways to engage the public with poetry. In looking at America and the UK, various poet laureates have done that really differently. So some poet laureates have gone out to country and rural and regional areas and given poetry workshops. One poet laureate in America, Jo Harjo, gave poetry workshops for politicians, which I thought was extremely brave of her. Simon Armitage has done really interesting stuff in the UK where he's written poems about climate change and written poetry walks and things like this. So I think, I like the idea that the remit is very broad, and the idea is that it's a poet who has that capacity to engage people, to bring the public on a journey. And beyond that, it's really up to the poet. And I think that's a wonderful sign of recognition for poetry as an art form that we haven't always had in Australia. And I think making it distinct from government, not letting government select the poet laureate, but just having it as a permanent kind of enshrinement in our cultural life is a really important step to bridging that gap that I was talking about between the quality of the books being published and the very small, generally speaking, the very small readership numbers for them.
Now, we are talking here in the context of the Stella Day Out and the Stella Prize itself, but it would be remiss of me not to point out that the Jaguar has actually received quite a number of award listings and has won many awards. I'm not going to list them, Sarah, but you did win the Colin Roderick Award and the Queensland Literary Award. When preparing my questions for you today, I wanted to look at what you do as a professor, which sounds like an odd thing to do, but it's very interesting if you look at what Sarah teaches. Now, Sarah teaches a course called Dangerous Ideas, Contemporary Debates in Publishing. Contemporary Debates in Writing. And Sarah, I looked at your syllabus and you're kind of laughing at me now, but one of the week's topics is a prize of one's own, literary prizes, prestige and power. And you taught that in first semester this year. And I guess I have two questions. Firstly, how did your students take that, you actually winning the awards as you are, kind of coordinating this course? But also more importantly, there are debates about prizes. Now, I'm in the pro-prize camp. I hope that's clear. But also, it is a really interesting debate. So I'd like to hand that over to you, Sarah.
Yeah, so I think, my students, you'd like to think that they all would know who you are, but, the relieving thing about being an academic is you always get cut down to size. So there's a whole slew of my students who wouldn't know that I've won the Stella and may not even know, I hate to say what the Stella is. This is just the state of universities at present. But, you know, so some of the students really obviously thrilled and know all about it, and that's been really, really sweet. And, you know, but it's not about me teaching. Teaching is not about you. It's really about getting the students to engage with their own thinking and their own ideas. So it's not like I go in there and say, oh, and I've won this one and that one. It's very much.
That would be so embarrassing.
I don't know how that would go down. I can't imagine myself doing it 100,000 years. But I do ask them, you know, I think to engage with a spectrum of ideas, because I think we all have received ideas about the way the world works. And one of the things that I think, you know, you want as a university student is to have that challenged and to go into university and test your ideas, test your thinking, and engage with opposing views, sometimes polemics. And so in that course, we do look at a range of different debates, and I actually even excruciatingly ask my students to give a formal debate, which they're all, you know, as you can imagine predictably thrilled about. But, you know, in doing that, we do look at prize culture, and for all of the people who say prizes are fantastic, and obviously I'm incredibly grateful as a beneficiary of several prizes, and, you know, I can see what they do for your career. There are, you know, dissenting views about that, and this idea that, you know, prizes vest a lot of attention in one person, and, you know, might be better, you know, perhaps they're making literature into a competition in a way that it doesn't necessarily need to be, and so forth. I mean, I think if anything, prizes, they provide a really good opportunity to debate literary worth, you know, and I think people love, you know, talking about, oh, that won a prize, but I don't get it, or I totally deserved that, or I think this one deserved it. It's almost a way of really trying to stake out thinking about what we find valuable in writing. And so for that reason, I think they all serve an amazing purpose. I mean, I'm not going to, certainly not after the year I say, I'm not going to get up here and say I don't think prizes are fantastic. They are incredible. But I also have to say, to be honest, at various times you do feel some guilt in that you feel like there are often lots of other really fantastic books that don't always get the attention that you would like to see them get. And so I think the other thing you can do as a prize winner, and I always try and do this, is also push forward the books that you think are fantastic. So it's complex because in Australia it's a small literary scene, and the reality is there's only so many prizes and so many books that can receive that recognition, and that can be really, you know, heartbreaking for fantastic books that don't. So it's complex, but, you know, the one lovely thing about teaching at universities is, you know, no matter how big you make it in your mind, your students will cut it right down to size again.
Sarah, I asked you a really cheeky question. Thank you for taking it with such grace, and I have no doubt that would be an amazing class to attend as a student. Coming back to your own work, I don't know quite how to phrase this. The Jaguar is a collection of poems that obviously weren't written at the same time. They were kind of, you know, brought together over a period of time, I suspect years. After you have such a personal work out in the world, like the Jaguar, do you still have, like, are you still compelled to write in a personal way? Would you go somewhere else in terms of topic or style or subject matter?
It's a good question. I mean, I think for me, I've been very slow between books. I've been about 7 years between my books of poetry. I'm sure my publisher wishes that I were a bit faster, but I sort of think I want each book to be a distinct act of thinking and a distinct kind of working through of something, whether that's aesthetic or personal or, you know, about the composition of the poems. So for me, it's not so much, I do write from life, and I can't see that changing because I think in poetry, personal perception and personal perspective are so integral to what allows you to write metaphors or get a poem to where it needs to be. It's hard to imagine. I do read books of poetry that you know, in which the poet is not really present as a figure. That's probably not going to change for me, I'd say. But I think I do look at each of my books, and I think there's living in that book, and I think that really matters to me, where you can see who you were as a person and that stage of life in the book. So I'm not sure. I mean, I'm not prolific, is one way of answering your question in my poetry. I publish less than I write. and I probably write less than I should. But I think, you know, poetry is all about the art of editing, and so in a sense, you want each poem to count, you want each word within each poem to count, and you want each book to have a distinct kind of presence and purpose. And so, yeah, it's probably a roundabout way of answering your question. I don't mind that. I think. Okay, here's a better way of answering that. I think for me, the books of poems that I love the most invite a sense of intimacy and a sense of a relationship with the poet. And that's the great trick of the poem, is that it's a little window into someone's innermost life. And I think I would hate to lose that. I like that my poems have that, I suppose, capacity to them. And that's what I seek out when I read the poetry of others as well. So I think probably not. I can imagine my poems remaining, you know, from my personal perspective. It's hard. You become the kind of poet you are at my age. I'm 40. You know, I can't see myself disappearing from my own poems anytime soon.
Sarah, when we leave this auditorium, there is a salon outside and there is readings selling copies of many different works by Stella listed authors. If someone hasn't read The Jaguar yet and they go out and they pick up a copy, it's a collection of poems. One doesn't have to necessarily start from the beginning. Where would you suggest someone starts?
I mean, I did spend like a month ordering it.
I know, but that doesn't mean people read it that way.
I mean, okay, ideally, you'd start with the first poem. But, you know, if you're not in the mood, I mean, I think one way of answering this is I thought long and hard about how to structure the book, and I was tempted on one hand to bury the lead, and in fact start with very different kinds of poems. So there's a kind of quite fun section, which is the third section of the book, which are really kind of playful love poems, and they're a bit spiky and they're a bit, you know, kind of comic, tragic. And for a time I had thought about making that the opening of the book, almost to ease the reader into the difficult territory, you know. And as it is, I ended up reversing that kind of thought. And so the book opens with basically a sequence about my father's death, and then moves sort of kind of backwards in time almost, chronologically. So if you don't feel like going, I mean, in a sense, I wanted the poem to have that very kind of penetrating opening. But if you're not in the mood for that, the third section is just very fun. And there's almost no dying in it at all.
That was a very eloquent answer to my very clunky question. Thank you, Sarah. I think we're about out of time, but I wanted to say a really personal thank you, Sarah. I know it's hard staring into the void on Zoom or any other app, so thank you for joining us today. And for everybody in the audience, can we have a really big round of applause so Sarah can hear it? Thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you to all in the audience. Bye, Sarah. And for those of you in the room, please don't forget, outside we have the salon. There are drinks there, there are books there, and Catherine Andrews. Oh, I'm being waved at. We're having a change.